An entire network of civilizations disintegrated in less than a human lifetime. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, a near-simultaneous unraveling that wiped out every major kingdom from Greece to Egypt around 1200 B. The historian Eric Klein called it the first globalized system to collapse, a puzzle that has challenged experts for generations. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the perfect storm of disasters that can topple even the most advanced societies and see the startling reflections in our own interconnected world. We will investigate why mighty empires like the Hittites vanished without a trace while others barely survived, and what cryptic warnings are buried in layers of ancient ash. What does the fragility of a forgotten world tell you about the one you live in today? A single clay tablet found in modern Turkey captures the spirit of this interconnected world. It is a letter from a Hittite king to the ruler of a neighboring kingdom, addressing him as my brother. The message is not a declaration of war, but a request. The Hittite king is asking for a shipment of iron, a precious metal at the time, to forge a special ceremonial gift. This was the normal business of the late Bronze Age, a period of diplomacy and deep trade links that stretched from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea. Historians often call this network the Great Powers Club. Its members were the superpowers of their day. There was the New Kingdom of Egypt, a land of immense wealth and monumental architecture, ruled by pharaohs like Ramesses III. To the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, stood the formidable Hittite Empire, masters of law and military innovation. Across the sea, the fortress palaces of Mycenaean Greece, like those at Mycenae and Pylos, commanded local kingdoms and traded fine pottery and olive oil. And along the coast of the Levant, wealthy port cities like Ugarit thrived as bustling hubs where merchants, languages, and goods from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Aegean all flowed together. This was not a primitive collection of isolated villages. It was a sophisticated, globalized system. Stability was maintained through detailed treaties, royal marriages that tied dynasties together, and a constant flow of correspondence on clay tablets baked hard for preservation. The famous Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic mail found in Egypt, reveal kings negotiating, exchanging lavish gifts, and even complaining about the quality of received gold. The economy was built on essential long-distance trade. Copper from Cyprus and tin from as far away as Afghanistan were shipped across the Mediterranean to alloy into bronze, the vital material for tools, weapons, and art. Palaces acted as central economic engines, with complex bureaucracies tracking every shipment and transaction. Archaeologist Robert Drews described this as a cosmopolitan age, an unprecedented time of cultural exchange and relative peace among the great kingdoms. Their world, with its interdependent supply chains and delicate diplomatic alliances, might feel strangely familiar. It raises a quiet question about our own foundations. How stable is a world that is so profoundly connected? The trowel of an archaeologist scrapes down through time, and the soil changes color. A dark, charcoal-rich layer appears, a stratum of ash and burnt mudbrick that speaks a universal, silent language of fire. From the hilltop citadels of Greece to the grand palaces of the Levant, this same haunting signature is found, dating to the final decades of the 13th century B.C. This is the destruction horizon, a thin line in the earth that marks not a local battle, but a continent-wide catastrophe. It is the first and most visceral clue to the scale of the collapse. At Hattusa, the magnificent capital of the Hittite Empire, the great walls and temples were consumed by an immense fire. The city was not just damaged, it was emptied, its political and spiritual heart extinguished forever. In Greece, the palace at Pylos met a similar fate. Yet here, the tragedy preserved a snapshot of final moments. The inferno that raised the palace complex baked the clay tablets in its archives solid, turning them into permanent records. These tablets, meant to track shipments of olive oil and the assignments of bronze workers, became the last administrative breaths of a kingdom in its death throes. At Megiddo, a site with layer upon layer of ancient cities, archaeologists find a similar story of violent conflagration followed by a much poorer, simpler settlement built atop the ruins. The evidence is not uniform, however. It tells different stories of ending. Some places show signs of a sudden, catastrophic assault, with layers of ash containing shattered valuables and the grim evidence of conflict. Others suggest a slower unraveling, a gradual depopulation as people simply drifted away from urban centers, leaving grand construction projects half-finished and forever abandoned. This physical record is undeniable proof of a profound rupture, a wave of devastation that swept across the eastern Mediterranean world within a generation. But these silent layers of ash hold a frustrating secret. They confirm the what and the when with startling clarity, but they stubbornly withhold the who and the why. The fire-blackened stones do not name the attackers. They present us with a monumental crime scene, but one where the weapon and the motive have vanished into the smoke of history. This forces us to look beyond the walls of any single burning city, to search for pressures so vast they could ignite a whole world. In the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, a story is carved in stone. The walls show a scene of utter chaos, a desperate battle where Egyptian soldiers defend their homeland against a bewildering array of foes. These enemies arrive in sleek ships, their families and belongings loaded alongside them, and they fight with a strange mix of weapons and armor. The Egyptian inscriptions give these invaders a collective, ominous name, the Sea Peoples. For modern historians, these reliefs are not just art, they are a primary source, a first-hand account of a crisis that nearly swallowed Egypt itself. Ramesses III boasts of a great victory, claiming he repelled these forces from both land and sea, saving his kingdom from the fate that had already befallen others. His records list the exotic names of the confederated tribes he fought, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and others. But who were they? This question lies at the heart of one of history's greatest detective stories. Were they simply opportunistic pirates raiding a weakened world? Or were they something far more tragic, entire populations on the move, carrying their families and possessions because they had nowhere else to go? Archaeologist Trude Dothan spent a career studying the material culture left behind along the coasts of the ancient Near East, piecing together clues from pottery, architecture, and burial practices. The evidence suggests a complex migration. After their clashes with Egypt, one group, the Peliset, settled on the southern coast of Canaan. The Bible would later know them as the Philistines. Their arrival is marked in the archaeological record by a sudden appearance of distinct styles, like new types of pottery and the introduction of pork into the local diet, clues that a new people with new traditions had put down roots. This settlement pattern is a critical clue. It hints that the Sea Peoples were not just hit-and-run raiders but migrants seeking a new home. So where did they come from? Theories point in many directions, from the islands of the Aegean Sea to the coasts of Anatolia, and even as far west as Sicily and Sardinia, based on the similarity of those ancient tribal names to later classical places. But their origins may be less important than their catalyst. What force could set so many different groups adrift at the same time, pushing them toward the wealthy, stable lands of the East? To call them merely invaders might be missing the point entirely. Perhaps they were not the spark that started the fire, but rather a billowing cloud of smoke, a highly visible symptom of a much larger continental crisis already raging in their homelands. Were the Sea Peoples the cause of the collapse, or were they its most dramatic refugees? The answer to that question forces us to look past the battles and toward the failing foundations of the world that produced them. A thriving garden can survive many challenges, but a relentless, rainless sun will wither even its strongest roots. This is the stark reality that climate science now reveals lay at the foundation of the Bronze Age collapse. While empires focused on diplomacy and trade, a far greater and more indifferent force was shifting, the very climate that sustained their world. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study ancient weather patterns, have uncovered compelling evidence of a profound and prolonged drought that gripped the eastern Mediterranean at the precise moment of the collapse. Their tools are not written records but natural archives. By extracting long cores of sediment from the bottom of ancient lake beds, researchers can analyze preserved pollen grains. A sudden decline in tree pollen and an increase in drought-resistant plants paints a clear picture of a landscape under stress. Similarly, inside caves, stalagmites grow slowly over centuries, and their chemical composition holds a record of rainfall patterns. Isotopic analysis of these stone formations from regions like modern-day Israel and Turkey shows a pronounced shift toward much drier conditions beginning around 1200 BC. This was not a single bad harvest season. It was a mega-drought, a climatic event that likely lasted for generations. Climate historian Brandon L. Drake synthesizes this data, arguing that this prolonged arid period placed an unbearable strain on the agricultural systems that were the absolute bedrock of every Bronze Age kingdom. These were not societies with global grain markets or massive irrigation projects like later empires. Their farming, particularly in the critical hinterlands of empires like the Hittites in Anatolia, relied heavily on predictable seasonal rains. Year after year of failed rains meant withered barley and emaciated livestock. Famine would have followed, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a creeping, inescapable shadow. The sediment cores from the Sea of Galilee, for instance, show water levels plummeting during this era, a direct indicator of a parched watershed. This environmental stressor attacks a civilization at its most vulnerable point, its food supply. When the harvests fail, the social contract phrase, farmers cannot pay their taxes in grain to the palace. The palace, in turn, cannot feed its soldiers, its artisans, or the vast bureaucracy that keeps the state running. Trade goods become scarce, and what little surplus exists is hoarded, leading to inflation and unrest. The great interconnected system, so robust in times of plenty, begins to seize up from the ground level. The drought did not strike everywhere with equal fury, but its effects rippled through the network. A famine in the Hittite heartland would have sent desperate refugees toward the coasts or south into Syria, putting pressure on neighbors already struggling with their own poor yield. It creates a world of scarcity where competition for dwindling resources turns violent, and the old rules of diplomacy between royal brothers begin to sound like a hollow echo. It forces us to consider a humbling parallel. How resilient is our own global garden, with its complex supply chains and dense populations, in the face of a changing climate? The sky, it seems, has always been the ultimate arbitrator of human ambition. A civilization can be defined by the materials it depends on. For the late Bronze Age world, that material was bronze, an alloy of two metals that rarely existed in the same place. Copper, one half of the recipe, was mined in great quantities on the island of Cyprus, a name that itself derives from the word for copper. The other vital ingredient, tin, was far more elusive. It traveled over staggering distances, sourced from mines as far away as modern Afghanistan, and possibly even from Cornwall in the British Isles. This was the lifeblood of the age, the essential substance for everything from a farmer's plow to a king's ceremonial sword. The entire glittering edifice of palace economies was built on ensuring this alloy kept flowing. Scholar Susan Sherratt describes these as redistributive systems, where the palace acted as the central heart, collecting raw materials, commissioning artisans, and distributing finished goods, thereby cementing its power and legitimacy. The stability of this system was a beautiful yet terrifying illusion of connectivity. A single broken link could bring the whole mechanism to a shuddering halt. We can see the breathtaking scale of this trade in the wreck of the Uluburan ship, discovered off the coast of Turkey. This vessel, lost around 1300 BC, was a floating treasury. Its hull contained 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, a ton of precious tin, alongside ivory, glass, and exotic goods from a dozen lands. It was a microcosm of the entire international network, a single thread in the vast web. When that web began to tear, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Piracy, spurred by desperation and the collapse of central authority, made sea lanes perilous. Political instability in supplier regions could dry up a critical source. And the overarching drought we discussed would have crippled the agricultural surplus needed to fund these expeditions in the first place. The tin simply stopped flowing. Without tin, you cannot make new bronze. Without new bronze, you cannot equip armies, repair tools, or produce the prestigious gifts that oiled the wheels of diplomacy. The economic cascade was swift. Port cities that thrived as hubs, like Ugarit in modern Syria, found their docks empty and their warehouses silent. In the final, frantic days of that city, a clay tablet was sent to the king of a nearby island, Alasia. The message is a plea from a queen, and its tone is pure despair. It reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The haunting line that follows reveals the total collapse of the system that once protected them. It asks, does my father not know that all my troops are stationed in Hittite land, and all my ships are stationed in Lucca land? They have not returned, so the country is abandoned to itself. This is the sound of an economic and defensive alliance dissolving into nothing. The palace, which once guaranteed security and commerce, could no longer protect its own borders or summon its own forces. The exchange of luxury goods between royal courts, those gold and ivory tokens of brotherhood, ceased entirely. When the gifts stop, the alliances they represent are already dead. This economic unraveling acted as a powerful amplifier, turning local hardships into a universal crisis. It begs a quiet, modern reflection. Our world, with its just-in-time supply chains for everything from microchips to medicine, is woven from a web of similar complexity. How many essential ingredients in your daily life travel from a single, distant source? The merchants of Ugarit never imagined their world could end until the day the ships stopped coming. The final feast in the Great Hall would have been a spectacle of light and sound. Inside, the ruling elite dined on rare meats and imported wines, surrounded by frescoes depicting their own divine power. Just beyond the palace walls, in the villages that supplied its wealth, farmers watched their fields turn to dust and wondered when the next royal tax collector would arrive. This stark divide is more than a moral contrast, it is a critical structural flaw. Historians of collapse, like Joseph Tainter, argue that societies become vulnerable when their institutions grow too complex and their elites lose legitimacy. The centralized palace system of the late Bronze Age was a masterpiece of administration, but it was also fragile, demanding ever more resources for diminishing returns. Think of it like building a taller and taller tower, each new floor requiring more material and offering less usable space, until the slightest tremor brings it all down. The linear B tablets from Mycenaean palaces are a perfect window into this top-heavy world. They record every jar of oil, every chariot wheel, and every worker's ration in meticulous detail. The economy was not market-based, it was a command system designed to funnel wealth and prestige goods upward to support the palace, its military, and its lavish displays of authority. This worked brilliantly in times of plenty, creating stability and funding grand projects. But when the climate shifted and harvests failed, the system had no flexibility. The palace still demanded its taxes in grain from starving farmers. It still conscripted men for armies it could no longer feed or pay reliably. The social contract, the unspoken agreement where people obeyed in exchange for security and order, began to tear. Archaeological evidence hints at this growing internal strain. In some regions, we see a dramatic concentration of luxury items like gold and fine jewelry in a very few elite burials, suggesting a steep rise in inequality. Elsewhere, there are signs that grand construction projects were abruptly abandoned, as if the labor force simply vanished or the will to command them dissolved. Did peasants rise up in revolt? Did lower-level officials or disgruntled soldiers stage coups against rulers they saw as failed? The ash layers do not neatly distinguish between a city burned by an outside invader and one torched by its own desperate inhabitants. A king's legitimacy rested on his perceived connection to the gods and his ability to provide prosperity and protection. When the rain stopped, the crops died, and strange enemy ships appeared on the horizon, that legitimacy evaporated. People stopped believing the old stories. They may have stopped obeying the old commands. The palace, once the mighty heart of civilization, became a target, a symbol of a broken promise. Its burning was not just an attack from outside, but potentially a collapse from within. This internal decay is the silent partner to every external disaster. It asks us to reflect on a timeless dynamic. How do institutions in any era maintain the trust of those they govern when the world grows unstable? A society can often survive a drought or an invasion, but it cannot survive when its own people no longer believe it deserves to stand. The most dangerous thing about a tightly woven net is that a single tear can unravel the entire structure. The late Bronze Age world was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, but a dense, interdependent system where the crisis of one became the catastrophe of all. This is the terrifying power of the domino effect, where the very connections that created prosperity became highways for spreading collapse. Historian Eric H. Klein frames this not as a simple fall, but as a systems collapse, a perfect storm where multiple stressors converge to overwhelm the entire network at once. To understand how famine in one empire could topple kingdoms an ocean away, we must trace the invisible threads that bound them together. Picture a single domino tipping in the Anatolian highlands. A prolonged drought withers the Hittite grain harvest. The palace at Hattusa, facing famine, can no longer send its promised shipments of silver and grain to its ally, the kingdom of Ugarit on the coast. Ugarit, in turn, cannot pay its Aegean trading partners for fine pottery and olive oil. This economic strain forces the Hittites to pull back their protective garrisons from client states to defend their own heartland, leaving border regions exposed. Now a second domino falls. Desperate, displaced groups from the stressed western regions, those we call the Sea Peoples, begin moving along the now poorly defended coasts, raiding for food and supplies. Their attacks make the sea lanes unsafe, severing the vital tin trade from the east. Without tin, no one can make new bronze weapons. A third domino tumbles. Mycenaean Greece, dependent on copper from Cyprus and already struggling with its own internal pressures, finds its military power crippled just as it needs it most. The king of Ugarit sends that frantic letter we heard earlier, revealing his troops are stationed far away in Hittite territory and his ships are off in Lycia. His city is a node in the network, and with its connections severed, it is left utterly defenseless, a single point of failure that is quickly erased. This cascade was not a slow march but a rapid, synergistic avalanche. Egypt might have survived the drought, but it could not survive the collapse of its trading partners and the sudden, violent migration of desperate peoples its borders. The system had no backup, no redundancy. Its greatest strength, its deep interdependence, became its fatal flaw. It makes you wonder about the invisible threads in our own world. How many essential things in your life depend on a single shipping lane, a lone supplier, or the stability of a distant nation? The rulers of the Bronze Age never saw the dominoes lining up behind them until the moment the first one began to fall. There is a terror far deeper than any invading army. It is the moment the solid earth beneath your feet ceases to be solid. For the people of the late Bronze Age, a major earthquake was not a natural disaster. It was a message from the gods, a sign that the cosmic order itself had been broken. The ground would heave, the mighty walls built by their ancestors would crumble into dust, and the psychological impact would be profound and lasting. This leads to a compelling and controversial theory that a cluster of devastating earthquakes may have been the final, brutal blow to an already reeling world. Geophysicist Amos Nur has studied the intense tectonic activity along the major fault lines that crisscross the eastern Mediterranean, from Anatolia down through Greece and the Levant. His research suggests the possibility of an earthquake storm, a period where seismic stress built up along these interconnected faults was released in a cascade of major tremors over a few decades. Such an event would not target a single city, but could ravage the entire region, striking at the very heart of urban civilization. The archaeological record offers tantalizing clues. At the legendary city of Troy, Level 7 shows clear signs of violent destruction, with walls collapsed inward in a way that points to seismic force rather than human attackers. In Mycenae, the mighty Lion Gate still stands, but sections of the great fortification walls show evidence of being shaken apart and hastily repaired. Perhaps the most dramatic example is the citadel of Tiryns in Greece, famed for its colossal cyclopean walls made of stone so large later people thought only mythical giants could have moved them. Archaeologists found these seemingly impregnable walls toppled in a uniform direction, lying like fallen dominoes, a pattern classic to earthquake damage, not warfare. A single quake could flatten a city, but could it collapse a civilization? Most scholars argue that while earthquakes are catastrophic, they are rarely the sole cause of a societal end. People rebuild as they have for millennia, but context is everything. Imagine a kingdom already crippled by drought, its grain stores low and its people hungry. Its trade networks are faltering, meaning precious resources like timber for rebuilding are scarce. Its military is dispersed or weakened, leaving it vulnerable in the aftermath. Then the ground shakes. The city's defensive walls, its symbols of security and royal power, are now piles of rubble. Granaries collapse, burying the last reserves of food. Aqueducts and irrigation channels are shattered, worsening the water crisis. In this shattered state, the kingdom cannot repel the desperate bands of raiders or migrants now at its broken gates. More importantly, the spiritual foundation of the state is demolished. If the king was the god's representative on earth, charged with maintaining cosmic order, what did it mean when the earth itself revolted? The quake would be seen as divine abandonment, stripping the ruling elite of their last shreds of legitimacy. In this light, seismic activity becomes the ultimate tipping point factor. It does not work in isolation but synergistically with every other stressor. A drought weakens the structure, economic failure removes the tools for repair, social unrest frays the will to rebuild, and then the earthquake delivers the physical coup de grace. It transforms a crisis into an irreversible collapse. This layered disaster forces a haunting question about resilience, one that echoes into our own time. How does any society, ancient or modern, prepare for the day when the ground itself is no longer a foundation, but an agent of chaos? It is a reminder that human history is not written solely on parchment or stone, but also in the restless movements of the planet we call home. A Hittite charioteer represented the ultimate expression of Bronze Age power. His vehicle was a masterpiece of engineering and wealth, requiring 2 specially bred horses, a skilled driver, and a warrior of noble birth. This was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol of an entire social order, where military dominance and political authority were reserved for a tiny, aristocratic elite. Yet, by the end of the 13th century B.C., this symbol of invincibility was proving tragically fragile. Historian Robert Drews presents a compelling argument that a quiet revolution in the way wars were fought helped shatter the Bronze Age world. He calls it the Infantry Revolution, a shift that turned the greatest strength of the great kingdoms into their most glaring weakness. The traditional chariot corps was phenomenally expensive to maintain. It demanded constant access to imported timber and leather, expert craftsmen, and vast tracts of land to raise and train horses. This complex system was perfectly suited to the centralized palace economies that created it. Battles were often clashes between these elite forces on open plains, almost like ritualized duels between kings, but new evidence suggests the rules of war were changing. Archaeologists find increasing numbers of a new type of sword from this period, longer and stiffer than earlier designs, built for slashing rather than thrusting. This was not a charioteer's weapon, it was an infantryman's tool. Similarly, the javelin, a simple spear meant for throwing, becomes more prominent. These were the weapons of a different kind of fighter, one who did not need a palace treasury to equip him. A mass of agile infantry, armed with javelins to disrupt chariot teams and long swords for close combat, could overwhelm the prestigious chariot units. They fought in loose formations on rough terrain where chariots were useless, and they required far less logistical support. The vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu in Egypt provide a startling visual clue. The invading sea peoples are shown fighting from the decks of their ships and in dense packs on land. Conspicuously, they are not depicted using chariots. Their warriors wear distinctive feathered or horned helmets and carry round shields and thrusting spears, a panoply designed for foot combat. This suggests they operated with a martial culture entirely different from the empires they assaulted. They were not trying to beat the kingdoms at their own game, they were changing the game itself. Could a band of raiders or migrants really overthrow an empire through tactics alone? The answer lies in the weakened state of those empires. A kingdom crippled by famine could not breed new war horses. A trade network in collapse could not import the special woods for chariot frames. The social unrest meant the pool of loyal, trained aristocrats for chariot crews might have dried up. In this context, the expensive, brittle military machine of the palaces became a liability. A decentralized, mobile force of infantry, perhaps drawn from the displaced and the desperate, could attack supply lines, raid undefended towns, and refuse to meet the royal army in the field where it was strong. They did not have to conquer the empire in a single grand battle. They only had to push it over while it was already teetering. This theory forces us to consider a profound historical irony. The very technological and social complexity that made the Bronze Age kingdoms so magnificent also made them slow to adapt. Their power was built on a specific kind of order, and when a new, chaotic form of warfare emerged from the fraying edges of their world, they had no answer for it. It highlights a timeless principle that no advantage, no matter how grand, lasts forever if it cannot evolve. What does it mean when the walls you have always relied upon are suddenly rendered obsolete by a change you never saw coming? A silent, invisible enemy can bring down walls that armies could never breach. Within the crowded streets of a late Bronze Age city, a new horror emerged, one that spread on a breath or a touch. People began to fall ill with fevers and weakness, the illness passing swiftly from family to family, filling homes with suffering and the streets with a new kind of fear. This leads us to a haunting and difficult to prove hypothesis that pandemic disease may have been a hidden actor in the collapse, an army of pathogens marching along the very trade routes that once built the world. While direct evidence is elusive, clues point to populations under immense biological stress. Egyptian records from the era of Ramesses III speak of a land afflicted by a pestilence. More telling are the skeletal remains from sites across the region, which show not only signs of chronic malnutrition, but also markers of physiological stress, like lines of arrested growth in teeth and bones. These are the signatures of bodies that have been severely weakened, not just by hunger, but potentially by repeated bouts of illness. Epidemiologists note that the conditions of the Late Bronze Age created a perfect storm for disease. Widespread famine compromises immune systems, making people far more susceptible to infection. The social disruption and mass movements of people, like those of the Sea Peoples, would have brought distant populations and their local pathogens into sudden, violent contact. The sophisticated trade networks, those marvels of globalization, now served as superhighways not just for copper and tin, but for microbes. A merchant carrying a bolt of fine linen could also be carrying a deadly virus, unwittingly delivering it from one palace port to another. We know of several devastating illnesses that existed in antiquity. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water, would have thrived in besieged or overcrowded cities with broken sanitation. An early form of bubonic plague carried by fleas on rodents could have found easy passage in grain shipments. The impact of such a pandemic goes far beyond the loss of life. It shatters the social order. Who will tend the fields, crew the ships, or man the walls when too many are ill or caring for the sick? The very fabric of daily life unravels. A powerful illustration comes from the Hittite Empire. King Mycenae II, who ruled just before the collapse, left behind a series of desperate prayers inscribed on clay tablets. He pleads with the gods, asking why a devastating pestilence has fallen upon the land of Hatti, killing his people. He describes it as a relentless burden, a clear sign that his kingdom was grappling with a health crisis of monumental scale long before the final collapse. While we lack the DNA evidence to name the specific pathogen, the historical parallel is profound. Consider the shockwaves sent through medieval Europe by the Black Death, or the global disruption of our own modern pandemic. These events show how quickly a biological crisis can overwhelm institutions, halt economies, and rewrite the course of history. In the fragile, interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, a major epidemic would have been the ultimate wild card, weakening every kingdom from within at the very moment they needed all their strength to survive. It forces a humbling realization that sometimes the most decisive force in history is one we cannot even see. The stone lions still stare from the gates of Hattusa, but they guard only silence. Of all the civilizations swept away in the collapse, the complete disappearance of the Hittite Empire remains the most profound mystery. Here was a superpower, a kingdom that rivaled Egypt, forged treaties as equals with pharaohs, and produced one of history's earliest known bodies of law. Their capital was a marvel, a sprawling fortress city in the highlands of central Turkey, filled with archives, temples, and granaries, yet by 1100 BC, it was utterly empty, its people and its royal line gone from history. The fall of the Hittites is not just another chapter in the collapse, it is the clearest example of a system pushed past its breaking point. Archaeologist Ugarit, who spent decades excavating Hattusa, pieced together a chilling sequence of decline. It did not begin with a thunderous invasion at the gates. The first cracks appeared in the empire's southern provinces, in places like Syria. These fertile lands were vital, acting as breadbaskets and buffer zones. As drought tightened its grip, these regions likely stopped sending their crucial grain shipments north to the capital. At the same time, the strategic coastlines came under intense pressure from the movement of sea peoples and other displaced groups, severing the Hittites from their maritime trade partners. The empire was being squeezed from the south and the west simultaneously. This exposed a fatal vulnerability. the Hittite heartland in Anatolia was not self-sufficient in food. It depended on that imported grain, much of it coming via treaty from Egypt. When the shipments stopped, famine would have gripped the central plateau. The archaeological record at Hattusa itself tells a story of deliberate abandonment, not a frenzied sack. Statues of gods and kings were carefully taken down from their pedestals. The great temples were sealed shut. The city's vast grain silos were left empty. This suggests a planned, tragic exodus, a leadership making the agonizing decision to evacuate the spiritual and political center of their world. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, left behind fragmented records that speak of naval battles against enemy ships and of securing grain from Cyprus. His words are those of a ruler clinging to the last threads of control, fighting to keep supply lines open for a starving populace. It was a losing battle. After his reign, the great capital was simply left to the elements. The mighty Hittite Empire did not transform, it shattered. In its place, smaller, weaker city-states emerged in northern Syria, often ruled by elites with Hittite names and traditions. Scholars call them the Neo-Hittite states. But the central authority, the imperial structure, was gone forever. What does it mean for a civilization of such scale to vanish so completely? It tells us that the collapse was not a surface-level political change. It was a demographic and cultural erasure. When the complex systems of distribution, defense, and governance failed, the population that depended on them could not hold on. They likely dispersed, assimilated into other groups, or succumbed to the hardships of famine and movement. The Hittite case shows that in a perfect storm, even the most formidable fortress is no refuge. Its silence asks us the hardest question of all. What remains of a people when their capital becomes a museum of ghosts? The Lion Gate at Mycenae still stands, its massive stones framing two proud, headless beasts. This was the entrance to a world of legend, the citadel of King Agamemnon from Homer's epic tales. Yet, the grandeur it represents vanished almost overnight, plunging Greece into a long twilight known as the Greek Dark Ages. The Mycenaean civilization was not a single empire, but a constellation of powerful, rival palace states, each ruled by a king called a Wanax from a fortified hilltop stronghold. At places like Mycenae, Pylos, and Turin, these palaces were the economic and military hearts of their world, controlling the production of olive oil, perfumed ointment, and fine pottery for trade across the Mediterranean. Classicist Oliver Dickinson describes this as a fragile, top-heavy system, dependent on a delicate balance of external trade and internal control. The evidence from these sites is stark and uniform. Near the end of the 13th century B.C., one palace after another was consumed by violent fire. At Turin, the destruction was so complete that the palace was never rebuilt. At Mycenae, the devastation was followed by a much smaller, poorer settlement huddled within the still imposing walls. This was not a temporary setback. It was a civilizational erasure. The population plummeted. The art of writing, the linear B script used by palace scribes to track every jar of oil and every bronze ingot, disappeared entirely. The skills to build tholos tombs and monumental bridges were forgotten. Greece entered a period of profound isolation and material simplicity that would last for centuries. Why did this happen here? Theories point to a combination of pressures both external and deeply internal. The disruption of long-distance trade with the East, a lifeline for the palace economies, would have been catastrophic. Without access to tin and copper, the bronze that armed their warriors and signified their status could no longer be produced. This economic shock likely intensified rivalries between the Mycenaean kingdoms themselves, leading to destructive warfare as each palace state scrambled for dwindling resources. Some tablets hint at social unrest, recording the movements of groups identified only as rowers, possibly conscripted laborers or a restless underclass. Could a revolt from below have toppled the Wanaks? The possibility remains, as a starving peasantry would have little loyalty to a king who could no longer provide security or sustenance. A poignant snapshot of the final days comes from the palace of Nestor at Pylos. Here, linear B tablets baked hard in the destructive fire record a state of high alert. They detail the deployment of coast watchers along strategic stretches of shoreline, a desperate last-minute effort to guard against a threat coming from the sea. Whether that threat was the Sea People's rival Mycenaeans or something else, the effort failed. The palace was burned and abandoned, its bureaucracy silenced forever. The silence that followed was profound but not empty. This dark age, born from collapse, eventually became the fertile ground from which classical Greece would emerge centuries later. The old, rigid palace hierarchies were gone. In their place, gradually grew the independent city-states, the polis, and the oral traditions that Homer would one day weave into epic poetry. The fall of the Mycenaean world shows us that sometimes a deep forgetting must precede a new beginning. What forms of beauty and order might eventually grow from the ruins of our own certainties? The Nile River was a lifeline in a world of drought. While other kingdoms watched their fields turn to dust, Egypt's agricultural calendar remained anchored to the river's predictable annual flood, bringing water and fertile silt to its banks. This natural abundance provided a critical buffer, allowing the new kingdom to endure the chaos that consumed its neighbors. Yet to call Egypt a true survivor is to misunderstand its story. What it experienced was not an escape, but a brutal, scarring struggle that left the kingdom forever changed. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen describes this period as a near-death experience for the pharaonic state. The nation's relative resilience came from a powerful combination of factors. Geographic isolation played a role, protected by deserts to the east and west. More importantly, its self-sufficient agricultural system, fed by the Nile, meant it was not immediately dependent on the failing international grain trade. And at its center stood a figure of immense symbolic power, Pharaoh Ramesses III, who could mobilize the entire nation for its own defense. The walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu tell the official story of this defense, a tale of glorious victory. The inscriptions boast of crushing invading forces from both land and sea. One relief famously shows Egyptian archers repelling ships filled with sea peoples, their families and possessions alongside them in a desperate migration. Ramesses declares he smashed them like birds trapped in a net, but read between the carved lines and a different, more desperate picture emerges. The very fact such monumental propaganda was necessary hints at a crisis of confidence. The records speak of repeated campaigns not just against the Sea Peoples, but also against invading Libyan tribes to the west. A nation does not fight for its life on two fronts simultaneously unless it is under extraordinary, sustained pressure. These wars, though successful in the short term, came at a devastating economic cost. The treasury was drained to fund the military. The once lucrative empire in Canaan, a source of tribute and trade, began to slip from Egyptian control as the pharaoh's attention and resources were pulled back to the homeland. The victory was Pyrrhic. Perhaps the most telling sign of Egypt's diminished power was not a battle it fought, but one it could no longer prevent. In the aftermath of the clashes, groups of sea peoples, most notably the Peliset, settled on the southern coast of Canaan. Egypt, exhausted and inward-looking, lacked the strength to dislodge them or reassert its authority. This single demographic shift altered the cultural landscape of the region permanently, planting the seeds for the Philistine kingdoms that would later appear in biblical narratives. Internally, the strain began to crack the foundations of the state. Near the end of his long reign, Ramesses III faced the first recorded labor strike in history, as the artisans building his royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings walked off the job because their grain rations were delayed. This was a profound breach in the pharaonic order, where the king was the ultimate provider. When he passed, the central authority he embodied began a slow, irreversible decline. The era that followed, known as the Third Intermediate Period, saw Egypt fracture with rival dynasties ruling from different cities and the unity of the new kingdom dissolve. So what does Egypt's ordeal teach us about resilience? It shows that even the most favorable geography and the strongest institutions can be brought to the brink by a converging storm of external threats. Egypt did not collapse, but it was broken. Its imperial ambitions ended and its golden age closed. Its story suggests that in a systemic collapse, there are no true winners, only those who manage to endure the longest, bearing the deepest scars. If even the mighty Nile could not offer complete protection, what does that reveal about the sheer scale of the forces unleashed upon the world? The smoke cleared, and a profound silence settled over the eastern Mediterranean. Where bustling ports and palace complexes once hummed with activity, there were now only ruins being slowly reclaimed by weeds. The world that emerged in the century after the collapse was a world of fragments. People gathered in small, scattered villages, often on defensible hilltops, their lives centered on survival rather than splendor. In these humble forges, a new sound began to ring out, the hammering of a different metal, iron, on anvils. This was not the end of history, but the raw, difficult dawn of a new age. Historians often call the centuries that followed a dark age, and in many ways it was. The great systems were gone. Centralized states with their tax collectors and scribes vanished. The vast international trade networks that shipped tin from Afghanistan and ivory from Africa fell silent. The art of writing, that cornerstone of bureaucracy, was forgotten in Greece and Anatolia. The skills to build cyclopean walls and paint vivid frescoes were lost. It was a dramatic simplification of society, a return to localism and subsistence. Yet, within this seeming emptiness, crucial seeds for the future were being planted. Historian Carol G. Thomas reminds us that collapse, while devastating, can also be a catalyst, a brutal but effective reset that breaks rigid structures and allows for new forms to emerge. The centralized palace economy was gone, and with it disappeared the extreme social hierarchies that kept metalworking and other advanced crafts as closely guarded royal secrets. This breakdown created space for innovation from the ground up. The most transformative shift was the move from bronze to iron. Bronze required a complex, long-distance supply chain for its two rare components. Iron, however, was different. Iron ore was relatively common, found in bogs and surface deposits across many regions. The technology to smelt it was more difficult, requiring higher furnace temperatures, but once mastered, it was a democratizing force. A village could have its own source of metal without relying on a king or a foreign merchant. Iron tools were harder and cheaper than bronze, leading to more effective plowshares for farmers and more accessible weapons. This technological diffusion empowered smaller communities. New political units began to coalesce from the ashes. Along the coast of the Levant, the Phoenician city-states like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre rose to prominence. Without the overshadowing power of Egyptian or Hittite empires, they turned to the sea, becoming the master traders and navigators of the early Iron Age. From this mercantile culture came a world-changing innovation, the Phoenician alphabet. It was a radical simplification of earlier, complex writing systems, using a small set of symbols to represent sounds. This was not a tool for palace accountants, but for merchants to keep records. Its adaptability meant it could be learned and used by many, not just a scribble elite. It would become the ancestor of the Greek, Latin, and ultimately our own alphabet. Elsewhere in the highlands of Canaan, a different experiment was taking shape. Displaced and regrouping populations formed loose tribal confederations, like the early Israelites, organizing around shared beliefs and kinship rather than a single powerful king. Their stories, eventually compiled into the Hebrew Bible, grappled directly with themes of exile, resilience, and covenant in a fractured world. We can see the texture of this post-collapse life at places like Karat in southeastern Anatolia. Here, a hilltop settlement was established centuries after the Hittite Empire fell. Its rulers, who claimed descent from the old Hittite line, left inscriptions not in the forgotten imperial language, but in Phoenician and a local dialect. They lived in a modest citadel, not a sprawling capital, yet they preserved stories and artistic motifs from the past while engaging with the new networks of the Iron Age. It was a simpler, harder life, but it was enduring. This period forces us to reframe our understanding of collapse. Is it only an ending, or can it also be a painful but necessary pruning? The Dark Age stripped away the old, brittle complexity of the Bronze Age, and from that simplified foundation, the classical world would slowly be built, village by village, innovation by innovation. The next time you see a simple iron tool or read a letter formed from an ancient alphabet, remember that their origins may lie not in a time of empire, but in the quiet, stubborn resilience that followed its fall. A single line of code can now trigger a cascade across continents, just as a single broken trade route once did. The fragmented clay tablets of Ugarit, pleading for ships that never returned, are not relics of a distant past. They are the first recorded whispers of a problem we know all too well: systemic risk in a globalized world. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not merely an ancient mystery. It is a deeply resonant case study, a warning etched in ash and clay about the fragility of interconnected systems. To understand our own 21st century vulnerabilities, we must look back to the first globalized collapse and listen to what it has to say. Modern scholars in fields from economics to climate science use frameworks that eerily mirror the multi-causal model of the Bronze Age downfall. Thinkers like Thomas Homer Dixon, who studies how societies adapt to complex crises, describe a concept called tectonic stress, where multiple pressures, environmental, economic, and social, converge to overwhelm a system's capacity to cope. This is precisely what happened 3,000 years ago. The parallels are not vague, they are startlingly specific. The prolonged drought that crippled Hittite agriculture finds its echo in our current era of climate disruption, with shifting weather patterns threatening global breadbaskets. The collapse of the tin trade, which severed the lifeblood of Bronze Age economies, mirrors the fragility of our own just-in-time supply chains. We have seen how a blockage in a single canal or a pandemic in a manufacturing hub can send shockwaves through the world economy, leaving store shelves empty and industries paralyzed. The geopolitical instability of failing Bronze Age states is reflected in modern regions where governance breaks down, creating power vacuoles that lead to conflict and displacement. And the mass movement of the Sea Peoples, entire populations seeking new homes, resonates deeply with the migration crises driven by conflict, poverty, and environmental hardship today. Our global network is infinitely more complex, but its underlying architecture shares the same potential flaw: deep interdependence without sufficient resilience. The palace redistributive economy, which centrally controlled resources, has a modern counterpart in our highly leveraged financial systems and concentrated corporate logistics. The 2008 financial crisis serves as a potent modern example of a systems failure. A crisis in a niche sector of the United States housing market, through a web of interconnected derivatives and debt, rapidly spiraled into a global recession. It was a domino effect powered by digital networks instead of clay tablets, yet the pattern was hauntingly familiar, a single point of stress revealing the hidden vulnerabilities in the entire structure. So what are the most vulnerable nodes in our own civilizational network? Is it the digital infrastructure that governs everything from banking to power grids? Is it the handful of nations that control rare earth elements essential for technology? Or is it the shared confidence in the systems themselves, the trust that money has value and that goods will arrive. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that civilizations do not fall from one cause alone. They fall when a cascade of crises, environmental, economic, and social, pile atop one another, and the institutions built for stability become sources of rigidity. This history challenges us to move from mere connectivity toward genuine resilience. It asks if we are building taller towers on the same shaky ground, or if we are learning to build differently from the lessons of the first collapse. The past in this light is not a foreign country. It is a signpost, and the message it carries is urgent, woven into the very fabric of our interconnected age. The end of an age is rarely as clean as the stories we tell. While the image of a single, catastrophic event wiping out civilization is compelling, the reality of the Bronze Age collapse is far more textured and uneven. It was not a universal, overnight apocalypse that left the map blank, but a protracted and varied unraveling that played out differently from region to region. To truly grasp what happened, we must first redefine what we mean by collapse. For historians, collapse does not mean the extinction of a people or the complete erasure of their knowledge. It specifically refers to the rapid disintegration of a particular complex political and economic order, the centralized palace system that defined the era. The end of that specific way of organizing society opened the door for new, often simpler forms to emerge. This nuanced view immediately challenges several persistent myths. There was no single invading horde that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean like a tidal wave. The sea peoples were a symptom, not a monolithic cause. Nor did a universal, instantaneous dark age descend everywhere at once. The experience was a mosaic. In some places, like the Hittite heartland, the collapse was absolute and the abandonment total. In others, like parts of the Levant, there was significant continuity of population and even local culture, just under a new, less centralized political reality. Consider the island of Cyprus, a critical node in the copper trade. Sites like Enigma show clear evidence of violent destruction around 1200 BC, with buildings burned and treasures scattered. But the story does not end there. Archaeologists found that the city was rapidly rebuilt on a new, more defensible plan. Its copper industry not only continued but thrived, adapting to the new, fragmented trade networks of the Iron Age. Life and commerce carried on, just without the overarching control of a distant great king. Similarly, far to the east, the Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia experienced the period as a time of severe contraction and hardship, but not total collapse. It lost territory and influence, yet its core institutions and written traditions survived, allowing it to re-emerge as a dominant power centuries later. Even in regions of profound disruption, many technologies and crafts persisted. Potters still made pottery, farmers still farmed, and the knowledge of ironworking, once it spread, was not forgotten. People adapted. They moved to more defensible hills, they focused on local subsistence, and they preserved oral traditions that would one day find new forms. This corrective is vital because it shifts our focus from pure catastrophe to human resilience and transformation. It asks us to reflect on how historical narratives are so often simplified into clear-cut stories of rise and fall, heroes and villains, light and dark. What complexities and quiet continuities in our own time might we be missing because we are drawn to the drama of the collapse headline? Understanding the Bronze Age not as a simple ending, but as a difficult, uneven transition, makes its legacy far more relevant. It shows that even in the breakdown of a world, the seeds of the next are always being tended, often in the very places we least expect. Leadership in a crisis is not about grand monuments, but about impossible decisions made in smoke-filled rooms. As the pressures of drought, migration, and economic failure converged, the kings and councils of the Bronze Age faced a test for which their systems were never designed. Modern crisis management studies identify several patterns that lead to failure, and they read like a checklist for the ancient world's final act. Concepts like groupthink, where a tight-knit leadership circle reinforces its own assumptions and dismisses outside warnings, become deadly when the world is changing faster than their understanding of it. The failure of imagination, an inability to envision a threat outside of historical experience, meant that many leaders likely saw the Sea Peoples as just another band of raiders, not the symptom of a continental unraveling. Most critically, the very structure of these kingdoms, their top-heavy, rigid bureaucracies, were engineered for stability and control, not for speed, adaptation, or decentralized action. A local commander seeing strange ships on the horizon could not act without orders from a distant palace, and that palace, drowning in administrative tablets about olive oil quotas, might have been the last to understand the true nature of the emergency. We can see this communication break down in the desperate letters that survive. The plea from the Queen of Ugarit, asking why her troops and ships had not returned, suggests a catastrophic failure in coordination between allied states. Messages were sent, but the system to receive and act on them was already breaking down. Within the palaces themselves, factionalism and indecision could have paralyzed response. Picture the Wanax of a Mycenaean citadel, his authority derived from a god-like status and control of bronze. When the tin shipments stop, his power literally melts away. Does he send his remaining soldiers to guard the coast or to secure the mountain passes? Does he ration the last grain for his warriors or his people? His advisors, drawn from a narrow aristocratic class, might offer only variations of the same traditional thinking. There is no playbook for the end of your world. This human factor is the final, volatile ingredient in the collapse. It asks a quiet, urgent question about our own time. How do our institutions, from governments to corporations, make decisions when faced with novel, cascading crises? Are they designed for the orderly world of yesterday or for the unpredictable shocks of tomorrow? The quality of leadership is not measured in calm seas, but in the storm where old maps are useless. The rulers of the Bronze Age were not foolish. They were simply trapped in a logic of power that the coming chaos had rendered obsolete. Sometimes the most important clues are not found on a battlefield, but in a quiet library. For centuries, the story of the Bronze Age collapse was a ghost story, whispered in ruins and half-remembered legends. The turning point came not with a dramatic excavation, but with the patient, painstaking work of decipherment. In the early 19th century, a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion stared at a slab of black stone pulled from the Egyptian sands, the Rosetta Stone. Its surface bore the same decree carved in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and the mysterious pictorial writing of the pharaohs. Cracking this code was the first key. It unlocked the voices of the Egyptians themselves, allowing us to read the victory hymns of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu and understand his claims against the Sea Peoples not as myth, but as recorded history. This was the first thread pulled, revealing that these were real kingdoms with real correspondence. Decades later, another script surrendered its secrets. In the early 1950s, a young architect named Michael Ventris made a breathtaking announcement. He had deciphered Linear B, the cryptic writing found on clay tablets in the burned palaces of Mycenae and Pylos. His work proved, to the astonishment of many, that the language of those legendary Greek kings was an early form of Greek. Suddenly, the inventories of chariot wheels and lists of women textile workers were not just artifacts. They were administrative records, the mundane paperwork of a functioning state frozen at the moment of its destruction. These decipherments transformed ruins into archives. They gave names to the players and revealed the intricate bureaucracy that held their world together. But writing only tells part of the story, the version intended for record. To find the truths the scribes never wrote down, science had to learn to read the earth itself. This is where archaeology moved from the spade to the microscope. In the late 20th century, researchers began extracting long cores of sediment from the bottom of ancient lake beds across the Near East. Washed into these silent depths over millennia were tiny, nearly indestructible time capsules, pollen grains. By identifying and counting these grains layer by layer, scientists like Israel Finkelstein could reconstruct the ancient landscape. A dramatic decline in oak and pine pollen, replaced by drought-resistant shrubs like sage and olive, painted an undeniable picture. The lush forests of the early Bronze Age were retreating, giving way to a drier, harsher environment precisely when the palaces fell. This was the first hard, scientific evidence for the Great Drought, a climatic shift so severe it was literally written into the mud. The search for climate clues then reached for the sky, or rather, the ice. Thousands of miles from the Mediterranean, in the pristine glaciers of Greenland, scientists drilled deep ice cores. Trapped within the annual layers of snow were microscopic bubbles of ancient atmosphere and traces of volcanic ash. These frozen records revealed a period of significant global cooling around 1200 BC, corroborating the drought data from the south. The world, it seemed, was getting colder and drier in tandem, a 1-2 punch for agricultural societies. Meanwhile, other technologies were illuminating the human scale of the collapse. The development of stable isotope analysis allowed researchers to study the chemistry of ancient bones and teeth. By analyzing isotopes of elements like strontium and oxygen, they could trace where a person grew up and what they ate. Studies on skeletons from post-collapse sites began to show surprising mobility, evidence that people were migrating over long distances, their bodies carrying the chemical signature of a homeland far away. This provided scientific backing for the grand movements described in the Egyptian reliefs. Perhaps the most vivid snapshot of the interconnected world, however, came from under the sea. In the 1980s, a sponge diver off the coast of Uluburan in Turkey stumbled upon a shipwreck over 3,000 years old. The excavation that followed was like opening a time capsule from the height of the Bronze Age. The ship's cargo was a map of the entire Mediterranean economy: 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of precious tin, ebony from Africa, ivory from elephant tusks, glass from Mesopotamia, and even a golden scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. This single vessel, lost just before the collapse, proved the breathtaking scale and reach of the luxury and resource trade that fueled the great kingdoms. Its carefully stacked cargo held the ghost of a system in perfect working order. Today, new tools continue to refine the picture. Light detection and ranging surveys, or LiDAR, use lasers shot from aircraft to digitally strip away forest canopy, revealing the ghostly outlines of ancient roads, field systems, and settlements invisible from the ground. This technology is showing us that the world after the collapse was not empty, but differently organized, with populations dispersing into smaller, fortified hilltop communities. Each of these discoveries, from a linguist's breakthrough to a chemist's analysis, acts like a single lamp in a vast, dark room. Slowly, patiently, they illuminate corners of the past, banishing old myths and confirming new theories. The cataclysmic volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, for instance, was long thought to be the spark that ignited the collapse, but refined radiocarbon dating and ice core evidence eventually showed it occurred over a century earlier, too soon to be the direct cause. Yet its memory, preserved in legend and ash layers, reminds us of the kind of traumatic events that shaped the cultural psyche of the age. What does it mean that we can now read the diary of a climate event in a stalagmite, or trace a refugee's journey in the chemistry of their tooth? It means our connection to this distant catastrophe is not just historical, but almost visceral. We are no longer just guessing at shadows, we are listening to the world itself tell its story, one fragment of pollen, one atom of metal, one whispered letter at a time. The walls of Troy may have fallen in legend long before archaeologists found its ashes. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, those foundational epics of the West, are not history books, yet they pulse with a strange, persistent memory of a lost world. They sing of a great alliance of Greek kings sailing east to besiege a wealthy city, and of a hero's desperate, decade-long journey home through a shattered and chaotic sea. Could these stories be the cultural echo of the Bronze Age collapse, a traumatic event transformed into myth? Scholars of cultural memory suggest that cataclysms too vast to be forgotten are often processed not as dry chronicles, but as archetypal narratives where historical truth is wrapped in the layers of symbol and heroism. The collapse did not just break kingdoms, it broke a worldview, and the pieces were gathered and retold for generations around fires, slowly crystallizing into the foundational stories of new cultures. Consider the potential threads linking myth to that historical rupture. The Trojan War saga, with its coalition of Mycenaean rulers and its focus on a strategic coastal city in Anatolia, mirrors the kind of large-scale military expeditions and conflicts over trade routes that defined the late Bronze Age. The Odyssey's theme of a perilous voyage home through a world of diminished kings, hostile shores, and lost companions feels like a poetic navigation of the post-collapse Mediterranean, where safe ports and familiar alliances had vanished. Across the sea, in the Levant, biblical narratives may hold similar echoes. The story of the Exodus, a people fleeing hardship and wandering before reaching a promised land, resonates with the mass movements and migrations of the era. The subsequent conquest of Canaan, tales of walls falling and new peoples settling, aligns archaeologically with the decline of Egyptian control and the settlement of groups like the Philistines along the coast in the early Iron Age. Even the broader structure of Greek mythology reflects this arc. It speaks of a heroic age, a time of demigods and grand quests, followed by a great cataclysm and a long descent into a less glorious age of iron. This could be the mythologized memory of the palatial Bronze Age and its devastating fall. Specific motifs abound. The invasions of mysterious sea peoples find parallel in Greek myths of seaborne invaders. Universal stories of great floods and famines, from the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to Greek lore, could preserve the collective trauma of the climatic disasters that struck the region. A poignant literary example is the Egyptian tale of Wenamun, written centuries later but set in the collapse period. It tells of a priest's humiliating journey to buy cedar wood, encountering petty rulers who mock Egypt's faded authority and pirates who threaten his life. It reads less as history and more as a cultural memory of a world turned upside down, where the old superpower was now just another supplicant in a lawless landscape. This transformation of chaos into story is not a distortion but a form of meaning-making. When linear history fails, narrative steps in. The trauma of collapse, the loss of central authority, the experience of migration and conflict, all were baked into the identity myths of the peoples who emerged from the Dark Age. These stories answered profound questions. Who are we? They answered, we are the survivors of a great journey, the conquerors of a chaotic land, the descendants of heroes who lived in a grander time. Why is the world so hard? Because a golden age ended, because the gods were angered, because we were tested. Myth became the vessel that carried the emotional and historical truth of the catastrophe across the silence of centuries. It makes you wonder about the stories we are telling today. What foundational narratives of crisis, resilience, and identity are being woven right now from the threads of our own global upheavals? The tales we tell about ourselves may one day be the primary evidence of what we endured. The map of the ancient world did not stay dark forever. Over the centuries that followed the great unraveling, flickers of light began to reappear, but they did so at wildly different speeds and in surprising places. This uneven recovery is a puzzle in itself. If the collapse was so universal, why did some regions rebuild complex societies within a few generations, while others remained in a simplified local state for 400 years or more? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in a delicate recipe for renewal where geography, memory, and sheer human resilience combined in unique ways. Historians like Peter Turchin, who study long-term historical cycles, note that recovery is rarely a simple bounce back. It is a reinvention, a process where the shattered pieces of the old world are reassembled into something new, often in the very spaces the old powers overlooked. Consider the stark contrast between two coastlines. Along the shores of the Levant, the Phoenician city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos experienced a remarkably swift resurgence. Their secret was a powerful geographic and cultural advantage. These cities had been trading ports for millennia, and while they suffered destruction, their deep knowledge of the sea and shipbuilding was never lost. With the great empires of Egypt and Hittite gone, there was no overlord to control or tax their ventures. They turned this vacuum into an opportunity, launching ambitious trading voyages across the Mediterranean. They were not rebuilding palaces, they were building networks. Their greatest innovation, the Phoenician alphabet, was a tool born of practical necessity for commerce, yet it would become the foundation for future literacy. Their recovery was fueled by adaptation, leveraging a preserved skill set to thrive in the new, decentralized world. Meanwhile, across the water, mainland Greece told a slower, quieter story. Here, the collapse had been almost total. The great palaces were ash, writing was forgotten, and the population had scattered into small, isolated villages in the hills. Recovery here was not a rapid resurgence but a gradual regrowth from the ground up. Life centered on the basic unit of the village, or later, the independent city-state known as the polis. This long, slow period we call the Greek Dark Ages was not an empty void but a necessary incubation. Without the rigid hierarchy of the Mycenaean wanaks, social structures could experiment. New forms of community, law, and shared identity slowly coalesced, eventually flowering into the archaic and classical periods. Their path back to complexity was slower because they had to rediscover it from a much more foundational level. Geography itself played a decisive role in who struggled and who thrived. In the Anatolian highlands, the heartland of the vanquished Hittite Empire, political fragmentation persisted for centuries. The region broke into a patchwork of small, rival kingdoms like Lydia and Phrygia. The devastating drought had hit this interior plateau especially hard, and without the cohesive imperial structure to manage crisis and redistribution, recovery was halting and localized. Conversely, regions that experienced less severe disruption became the new cause of power. Look east to Mesopotamia. While the Bronze Age collapse weakened its kingdoms, the Assyrian heartland was not utterly shattered. It retained more continuity in population, administration, and military tradition. As the climate pressures of the Mega-Drought finally began to ease, this region had a head start. From this foundation, the Neo-Assyrian Empire would rise with terrifying speed, becoming the first true Iron Age superpower, fueled by the very technologies that had diffused in the aftermath of the collapse. The end of the prolonged drought was perhaps the most fundamental precondition for any recovery. As rainfall patterns eventually stabilized and harvests became reliable again, the basic equation of human survival shifted. Populations could grow, surpluses could be stored, and the energy spent on mere subsistence could be redirected toward trade, specialization, and art once more. This environmental reset provided the stage, but the actors were the communities who had preserved kernels of knowledge, whether it was a shipwright's craft in Phoenicia or a smith's ironworking technique in a Greek village. Recovery, then, was not an automatic return to what was lost. It was a creative act, a new chapter of innovation written by those who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that survival depends not on the height of your walls, but on the adaptability of your spirit. What forgotten skills or forms of community, nurtured in quiet corners today, might one day light the way forward from a future fracture? Human minds are drawn to singular, spectacular events, a single strike from the heavens that could explain a world's end. When faced with a mystery as vast as the Bronze Age collapse, it is tempting to look for that one cataclysmic answer: a volcano, a comet, a divine wrath that neatly ties the story together. Beyond the scholarly consensus of a perfect storm, more speculative theories have emerged, and while they often lack conclusive evidence, they offer a fascinating glimpse into how we grapple with historical chaos. The most persistent of these ideas points to a volcanic eruption of almost unimaginable scale. The island of Thera, modern Santorini, did indeed explode in a cataclysm around 1600 BC, over a century before the main collapse period. The ash from this event blanketed the eastern Mediterranean, and the ensuing tsunamis would have devastated coastal settlements on Crete and beyond. For a long time, this eruption was the prime suspect. Yet, as dating methods became more precise, from tree rings to ice cores, a clear gap emerged. The world of the great palaces did not end in 1600 BC. It carried on, even adapted. The eruption was a monumental disaster, but not the knockout blow. It serves as a powerful reminder that even the most violent natural events may shake a civilization without breaking it, unless other pressures are already at work. A more cosmic theory suggests an impact from space, a comet or asteroid strike that triggered global cooling and agricultural failure. Proponents sometimes point to the controversial Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which proposes a celestial event around 12,800 years ago. Some have tried to link similar mechanics to the 12th century BC. The search for evidence, however, has come up largely empty. Geologists have not found a widespread layer of impact debris, like the rare element iridium, in soil layers from that exact time. There is no confirmed crater of the right age in the region. While the idea of a cosmic winter is compelling, the physical proof required to elevate it from speculation to credible cause simply is not there in the archaeological record. Other fringe ideas venture further, proposing cycles of cosmic energy or resonant frequencies between civilizations that somehow led to synchronized failure. These concepts, while imaginative, operate outside the realm of testable evidence that defines historical and archaeological research. They belong more to the realm of metaphysical speculation than to evidence-based scholarship. So why do these theories hold such appeal? They satisfy a deep narrative craving for simplicity and drama. A single, blinding event is easier to comprehend than the slow, grinding, interconnected failure of climate, economy, and society. It provides a clean villain, an act of God or nature, rather than implicating the complex, vulnerable systems that humans build. This tension between a spectacular cause and a systemic one is crucial for any student of history. It asks us to reflect on our own instincts when we see crises unfold today. Do we search for a singular villain or a simple explanation, when the reality is almost always a web of interconnected failures? The lesson from examining these fringe ideas is not that they are worthless, but that they highlight the importance of evidence. They remind us that responsible history is a discipline of patience, where the story is built fragment by fragment, validated by the soil, the ice, and the stone. The true explanation for the collapse may be less cinematic than a comet's flash, but it is ultimately more profound, a warning written not in fire from the sky, but in the fragile threads of our own interconnected world. A Mycenaean gold cup gleams with the image of a bull, its form captured in a fluid, naturalistic style that speaks of a confident, cosmopolitan world. Beside it sits a simple Iron Age cooking pot, its surface decorated only with concentric circles and zigzag lines. These two objects are not just separated by centuries, they are separated by an entire worldview. The cultural legacy of the collapse is written most clearly not in texts, but in this dramatic transformation of art and everyday objects, a silent witness to the profound societal shift from palace luxury to community survival. Art historian Susan Langdon notes that art in the Bronze Age was largely an instrument of the state, designed to project power, celebrate the elite, and facilitate the international dialogue between royal courts. This was the age of the grand fresco, like those from the Minoan Palace of Knossos, depicting graceful athletes and nature scenes, or the exquisite gold funeral masks from Mycenae that aimed to immortalize the features of a king. Skilled artisans, supported by palace workshops, worked with imported materials like ivory, lapis lazuli, and precious metals to create luxury goods that were traded as diplomatic gifts. Their style was often naturalistic, fluid, and shared common themes across empires, a visual language of power understood from Egypt to Greece. The world that emerged from the collapse could not support such grandeur. The great workshops vanished with the palaces that funded them. The knowledge of large-scale fresco painting, intricate repoussé metalworking, and fine gem carving faded. In its place arose a new aesthetic, one that was local, communal, and symbolic rather than representational. In Greece, the pottery of the early Iron Age, known as proto-geometric, tells this story. The swirling, organic patterns of earlier styles gave way to precise, compass-drawn circles, meanders, and stark linear designs. This was not a decline in skill, but a shift in purpose and context. These pots were made by smaller, local workshops for a broader segment of society. Their beauty lay in orderly, balanced abstraction, perhaps reflecting a community seeking harmony and structure in a fractured world. The human figure, once depicted in lively detail, largely disappeared from decoration, only to re-emerge centuries later in the stiff, geometric forms of the later Greek Dark Age. Yet, to see only loss is to miss the powerful threads of continuity that persisted in the hands of everyday people. While the grand styles vanished, fundamental technologies and forms endured. The basic shapes of storage jars and drinking vessels changed little. The potter's wheel kept turning. More significantly, certain religious symbols and cult practices demonstrated remarkable resilience. A compelling example is the evolution of the goddess with upraised arms. This distinctive figurine type first appears in the Bronze Age palaces of Minoan Crete, a symbol of a powerful female deity. Centuries after the palaces fell, similar terracotta figurines are found in small shrines across Crete and later in Greece, their arms still raised in a gesture of blessing or epiphany. The goddess, it seems, survived the death of the kings who once co-opted her image. In metallurgy, while the lavish goldwork of the elite ceased, the crucial knowledge of smelting and forging did not die. It simply shifted its focus from ornamental bronze to utilitarian iron, a technology that would eventually empower new forms of society. This artistic journey from the specific to the symbolic, from the international to the local, forces a reflective question about our own time. If archaeologists of the far future were to sift through our material culture, what would they conclude? Would they see our globally identical smartphones as evidence of a new, homogeneous international style, sponsored by corporate rather than royal power? Would our mass-produced goods suggest a loss of local craft or a new form of accessibility? The objects we create and cherish are never neutral. They are a mirror, however distorted, of what a society values, fears, and believes is worth preserving. The quiet story of a geometric pot replacing a golden cup is not one of mere decline, but of profound adaptation, a testament to the human need to create meaning, even when the old meanings have turned to ash. The gods of the Bronze Age were guarantors of a cosmic bargain, kings ruled by their mandate, priests performed rituals to ensure the harvest, and victory in battle was proof of divine favor. When the world began to burn, that sacred contract was broken. For the survivors, the collapse was not merely a political or economic disaster. It was a spiritual cataclysm that shattered their understanding of the universe itself. Imagine the priests in the temple of a storm god, chanting the old prayers for rain as the sky remained a relentless, cloudless blue, season after season. Imagine the Hittite king, the chief priest of his empire, offering sacrifices to a pantheon that seemed powerless to stop the famine gnawing at his people's bones. This crisis forces a profound and painful question known in the study of religion as theodicy. If the gods are powerful and just, why do they allow such immense suffering? The collapse presented this question on a civilizational scale, and the answers people forged in the ashes would reshape faith for centuries. We can trace this spiritual reckoning in the silent stones of abandoned temples. The grand religious complexes, so often intertwined with royal palaces, fell into disuse and ruin. At Hattusa, the great temple of the storm god was emptied and sealed, its statues carefully buried as if to protect the deities themselves from the encroaching chaos. This was not just a logistical failure, it was a symbolic one. The state-sponsored religion, with its elite priesthood and lavish offerings, had failed to maintain the cosmic order. In the power vacuum that followed, religious expression often became smaller, more personal, and closer to home. Archaeological evidence suggests a possible rise in household cults and the veneration of ancestors, practices that offered comfort and a sense of control at the family hearth when the great temples lay silent. People turned to what was immediate and tangible in a world where distant gods seemed to have turned away. This trauma also catalyzed the transformation of the gods themselves. In times of stability, deities often have defined roles: a god of war, a goddess of fertility. But in crisis, these roles can blur, merge, or be reimagined entirely. We see hints of this in the Levant, where the cultural ferment of the post-collapse period likely influenced early Israelite religion. Scholars note that some characteristics of the Canaanite high god El, such as his wisdom and patriarchal authority, may have been absorbed into the emerging conception of Yahweh. This was not simple borrowing, but a profound reinterpretation born from a search for a deity who could make sense of a fractured world. The biblical book of Judges offers a powerful literary echo of this spiritual landscape. It portrays a cyclical, chaotic time with the repeated refrain, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes." This could be a cultural memory of the post-collapse Levant, a period where central authority and the old divine order had dissolved, leaving communities to forge a new covenant with a God of justice and law in the midst of the rubble. Even in Egypt, which survived, the spiritual shockwaves were profound. The meticulous mortuary practices and the pharaoh's absolute role as the guarantor of Mot, or cosmic order, were deeply challenged. The labor strike at Deir el-Medina, where tomb workers protested unpaid rations, was more than an economic grievance, it was an act of spiritual doubt. If the god-king could not provide, was the cosmic balance truly intact? The gradual democratization of the afterlife in the following centuries, where concepts once reserved for pharaohs became accessible to more people, may reflect a broader, more anxious search for personal salvation in an unpredictable world. This search for meaning in the aftermath of catastrophe is a deeply human constant. When the frameworks we rely on for stability, whether divine or political, are proven fragile, we are forced to rebuild our worldview from the foundation up. The spiritual legacy of the Bronze Age collapse reminds us that the stories a culture tells about itself, its gods, and its place in the universe are often forged in its most difficult hours. It prompts a quiet reflection for our own time. When faced with global crises that challenge our sense of control and progress, where do we turn to find meaning? How do our own modern beliefs, whether secular or religious, adapt and respond when the world feels like it is coming undone? The collapse did not just destroy palaces, it compelled humanity to look into the void and begin the slow, courageous work of reimagining what might lie on the other side. A gold Mycenaean mask now shares cultural space with a pixelated warrior on a screen. The story of the Bronze Age collapse, once confined to academic journals and excavation reports, has broken into our modern imagination, becoming a dramatic setting for films, video games, and best-selling books. This ancient catastrophe offers a perfect recipe for compelling narrative, a world-ending mystery filled with lost kingdoms, enigmatic invaders, and the haunting question of how civilizations fall. Popular culture has become one of the most powerful teachers of this distant past, for better and for worse. Documentaries like the one based on Eric Klein's book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, bring the scholarly consensus to a broad audience, using computer-generated reconstructions to visualize grand palaces and animated maps to trace the collapse of trade routes. They excel at presenting the complex multi-causal theory, framing the collapse as a systems failure. Meanwhile, strategy video games like Total War, Pharaoh place you directly in the crumbling world. You manage cities, command armies of chariots and infantry, and face the looming threat of the Sea Peoples as an ever-present game over condition. Here, the collapse is simplified into a military and logistical challenge, a series of battles to be won or lost. The game's great strength is its visceral sense of the era's material culture, the look of the weapons, the architecture of the temples, and the scale of the landscapes, making the period feel tangible in a way textbooks cannot. Historical novels such as The Shadow of the Sun attempt to bridge this gap by weaving personal stories of fictional characters into the grand historical tapestry, giving emotional weight to the drought, the failing harvests, and the fear of approaching ships. Public historians note this popularization is a double-edged sword. The benefit is immense, sparking curiosity and bringing an obscure period to life for millions who might never pick up an academic tome. It creates a shared cultural reference point for a pivotal moment in human history. The pitfall, however, is inherent in the need for drama. The slow-moving, interconnected disaster of drought, economic failure, and social unrest is often compressed into a more thrilling story of invasion and battle. The Sea Peoples, in particular, become a convenient villain. In many portrayals, they are a faceless horde of fearsome barbarians, a single destructive force sweeping in from the sea. This overlooks the nuanced archaeological and textual evidence that many of these groups were likely complex societies themselves, displaced populations carrying their families and cultures, pushed into motion by the same pressures collapsing the great kingdoms. A more thoughtful representation might frame them not as mindless destroyers, but as climate refugees and symptoms of the wider systemic failure. An interesting echo of this theme appears in modern stories not directly about the collapse. The 2021 series The Last Days of Ptolemy Gray uses a fading individual's memory as a metaphor for societal forgetting, a poignant parallel to how a civilization's knowledge can fragment and disappear. This gets at a deeper truth popular media can convey: the profound human experience of loss and the struggle to preserve identity when the world unravels. So, how do the stories we consume shape our understanding of history? They teach us what to look for and what to feel. A game emphasizes strategy and conflict. A novel highlights personal resilience. A documentary underscores interconnected causes. Each frame offers a different lens, and together they can build a richer, if imperfect, picture. The next time you watch a scene of bronze-clad armies clashing or a city burning in a film, look past the spectacle. Ask what story is being told about why things fall apart. Is it a simple tale of conquerors and the conquered, or does it hint at the fragile, invisible threads of trade, climate, and trust that truly hold a world together? Popular culture may simplify, but it also invites us in, making the ghosts of Hattusa and Mycenae feel startlingly, urgently close. In a quiet laboratory, a scientist extracts a minuscule sample from a human femur 3,000 years old. This is not a search for treasure, but for something far more valuable, a story written in the genetic code. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse is far from solved. It is a living, breathing field of inquiry where the questions are becoming more precise, and the tools to answer them are nothing short of revolutionary. We are no longer just reading the words left behind by kings. We are beginning to listen to the whispers of the land, the climate, and even the bones of ordinary people. The consensus of a perfect storm remains, but now researchers are using cutting-edge science to measure the force of each individual gale. Ancient DNA analysis can now trace population movements with astonishing detail, revealing whether a skeleton found in a burned city was born there or had traveled from hundreds of miles away. Strontium isotope analysis works like a geological passport. The unique chemical signature of the local bedrock where a person grew up is locked into their teeth, allowing scientists to map individual journeys across the ancient landscape. Did the people we call the Sea Peoples share a common genetic origin? Preliminary studies suggest a complex mix, pointing not to a single homeland but to a confederation drawn from across the Aegean and Anatolia. Meanwhile, climatologists are refining the picture of the Great Drought. By studying speleothems, the intricate cave formations like stalagmites that grow over millennia, they can now reconstruct rainfall patterns on an almost annual basis. The goal is to create a high-resolution timeline to see if the drought arrived in a sudden, catastrophic plunge or as a series of worsening waves, and to correlate it exactly with the layers of destruction in the archaeological record. Archaeologists in the field are asking new, human-centered questions. We know the palaces burned, but what was the experience of the farmer, the potter, or the merchant? Excavations are now focusing not just on citadels, but on the smaller settlements and countryside around them, searching for clues about daily life in the decades of decline. At key sites like Megiddo and Hattusa, teams are using ground-penetrating radar and drone surveys to see entire city layouts without moving a single stone, revealing how urban planning changed in a time of fear. Some of the biggest puzzles remain tantalizingly open. While we know the Sea Peoples were a factor, their exact origins and motivations are still debated. Was their movement a cause of the collapse or a desperate result of it? Scholars also grapple with the precise sequence of events. Did the Hittite heartland fail before the Mycenaean palaces, or was it a simultaneous unraveling? And perhaps the most profound question of all, what was the relative weight of each factor? How much did the drought contribute versus the trade collapse versus internal rebellion? The quest for answers is global, connecting ice cores from Greenland to sediment samples from the Nile Delta. This ongoing research makes one thing beautifully clear: history is not a static record of what we already know. It is a dynamic detective story where every new technological advance shines a light into a dark corner of our past. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is still being written, one fragment of bone, one layer of cave stone, one satellite image at a time. What will we learn when the next sample yields its secret? All these scattered fragments of evidence now lie before us like pieces from a dozen different puzzles. The dark line of ash from 100 burnt cities, the silent pollen grains telling of endless drought, the stacked copper ingots on a sunken ship, the frantic words on a baked clay tablet. Each piece speaks of a different kind of disaster, but when you finally bring them together, they lock into place, revealing a single, terrifying image. This is not a story of one kingdom falling to an invader. It is the story of an entire system, a complex and interconnected world, experiencing a cascading systems failure. Scholar Eric H. Klein describes it as a perfect storm where multiple stressors converged, any one of which the civilizations might have weathered alone. Together, they created a vortex of collapse from which there was no escape. The sequence begins not with a bang, but with a slow, silent pressure. For generations, a profound drought tightens its grip on the eastern Mediterranean. Rainfall becomes unreliable, harvests begin to fail, and the life-giving rivers carry less water. This environmental stress is the first domino placed by forces far beyond human control. It strikes at the absolute foundation of these agrarian states, their food supply. In the Hittite heartland of Anatolia, a kingdom built on grain shipments from its provinces and allies, the famine is not just a hardship, it is an existential crisis. The palace, the central processor of the economy, now faces a terrible equation. It must feed its people, its soldiers, and its vast bureaucracy with a rapidly shrinking surplus. This is where the second domino begins to wobble, the intricate web of international trade. The great kingdoms were not self-sufficient. They were specialists in a globalized network. Think of that single, vital commodity, tin. Mined in distant Afghanistan, it traveled over land and by sea to the workshops of Cyprus, Greece, and Anatolia, where it was alloyed with Cypriot copper to make bronze. This bronze armed the soldiers, tipped the farmer's plow, and was the very medium of elite status and diplomacy. Now, climate stress creates scarcity and unrest everywhere. The farmers who cannot pay their taxes in grain cannot fund trade expeditions. Political instability makes land routes dangerous. Piracy, born of desperation, makes sea lanes treacherous. The tin shipments slow to a trickle, and then they stop. Without tin, you cannot make new bronze weapons. A king's military power, the ultimate guarantor of his rule, literally begins to rust away in its armories. The economic seizure ripples outward, pulling down the third domino, social and political stability. As the palace fails to deliver its ancient promise of security and sustenance, its legitimacy evaporates. Why obey a king who cannot fill the granaries or equip the army? Inequality, always present, now becomes a fatal rift. The starving peasant looks at the half-finished royal tomb or the stockpiled luxury goods in the palace and sees not power but failure. Internal rebellion becomes a possibility not from ideology but from sheer survival instinct. The social contract, the glue of civilization, dissolves. Now the fourth domino falls, the military revolution. Into this landscape of hunger, weak armies, and fraying social order come new pressures from the periphery. Displaced populations, perhaps from regions hit even harder by the drought, begin to move. These are the groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. They are not a unified army, but a migratory wave of men, women, and children seeking new land. Crucially, they fight not with the expensive, palace-dependent chariots of the great kingdoms, but as massed infantry with new swords and javelins. They attack the weakened coastal cities, the very nodes of the faltering trade network. A city like Ugarit sends its desperate plea, only to find its troops are stationed far away in a collapsing allies' territory, and its ships are gone. It is a node in a network that has already gone dark. The final domino is the failure of response, the crisis of leadership and imagination. The kings and their advisors are trapped in the logic of a world that is vanishing. Their institutions are built for control and ritual, not for rapid adaptation. They cannot conceive of a threat that is not a rival king, but a systemic unraveling. Orders are sent, but the messengers are intercepted or the local commanders have already fled. The intricate bureaucracy that once tracked every jar of oil is now a monument to a kind of order that no longer exists. When the ground itself shakes in a cluster of earthquakes, it is seen not as a natural disaster, but as the gods formally revoking their mandate. The will to rebuild shatters. So watch the cascade in motion through the lens of a single Hittite soldier. He feels the hunger first as the grain rations shrink. He watches his bronze spear tip break, knowing no smith can forge a replacement without tin from the east. He hears rumors of villages abandoned and of strange ships on the distant coast. Then comes the order to march south to prop up an allied city, leaving his own family and lands undefended. He fights a desperate battle against unfamiliar foes who fight in a strange, chaotic way. A message might arrive telling him the capital itself is burning, that the king is gone. His world in that moment ceases to have a center. He becomes a refugee, a survivor, a piece of human flotsam in the great unraveling. This is the coherent narrative, not of a single event, but of a process. A process where environmental shock triggers economic failure, which fuels social unrest, which invites external pressure, all while the institutions designed for stability become sources of fatal rigidity. The collapse was not an accident of history. It was the logical, tragic outcome of a beautifully complex world that had forgotten how to be resilient. The silent stones of Hattusa do not just mark a forgotten empire's end. They hold up a mirror, one where the reflections of our own interconnected world stare back with unsettling clarity. We have walked through the ash layers and deciphered the desperate letters, tracing a cascade where climate, commerce, and community all failed in concert. The collapse was not a mystery of a single cause, but a masterclass in systemic risk, a demonstration of how the very connections that create prosperity can also transmit catastrophe. This is the enduring legacy of that distant unraveling, a lesson written not for kings, but for all of us living in a tightly woven global network. Historian J. B. Berry once wrote that history is a seamless web. The threads that snapped 3,000 years ago, the trade routes, the diplomatic bonds, the trust in institutions, are the same kinds of threads that now bind our world together. Our climate is changing, placing new stresses on food and water. Our economies are linked by digital pulses and shipping containers, creating breathtaking efficiency but also breathtaking vulnerability. Our social contracts are tested by inequality and misinformation. The parallels are not exact, but the pattern is hauntingly familiar. Resilience, then, is not found in the height of our walls or the size of our stockpiles. It is cultivated in the adaptability of our systems, the sustainability of our practices, and the depth of our cooperation. It asks us to look at the fragile nodes in our own network and ask what would happen if this one thread were cut. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is ultimately a story of human choices made within the limits of their understanding and their environment. It grants us no simple prophecy, but a profound warning and a measure of hope. For we are the first generation with the full view of that ancient storm, armed with the knowledge of how complex systems fail. This awareness is our greatest tool. It allows us to see the web we have woven and to choose, deliberately, to mend its weak points and strengthen its connections. If this journey into humanity's first global crisis has given you a new perspective, I would love to hear what parallel you find most compelling for our world today. Share your reflections in the comments below, and if you are curious about other pivotal moments where history turned, consider subscribing for more explorations into the forces that shape our past and, by extension, our future. Thank you for joining this investigation into the fragile foundations of civilization.